So, first of all, who are you? Please introduce yourself, Laura.
Yeah, so I'm Laura Dutton-Eves. I am a former police constable with Merseyside Police. I was a police officer for 13 years and left in January last year to become a lecturer.
So you're a lecturer. Where are you a lecturer?
I'm based at Salford University of Salford.
And so there's various routes into learning how to be a police officer in the UK. What's your model that you teach?
So the particular one I teach is the police constable entry route, which is the basically the apprenticeship scheme. So the officers on our course will be employed by a police force. They will.
Chris, do you fancy finding a tech person for a battery for this, because he's going to get worse? Has he? Right, we'll muddle on until we get another one.
Yeah, so they will apply directly to the force and be appointed as a constable, and then they will come to ourselves to do their initial training in year one, go on to force, do periods of proactive duties, and then return in year 2 and year 3 on study blocks.
So it's a 3-year training course?
Yes, it is.
Let me just tap here. Hello.
Hello.
So, Jen, the same question to you, please. If you'd be so kind as to introduce yourself.
So my name's Jen. I'm the Programme Student Lead for Policing Programmes at the University of Law. I'm normally based at the Bloomsbury campus. I did work as a police constable very briefly. Before that, I was an academic. My background is in criminology as well as in forensic and investigative psychology.
So you're teaching in a different model. So can you explain how that works for us?
Yes, so we offer the degree in professional policing, which is also part of the PEQF, which is part of the same overall framework that the PCDA is on. So the key difference would be that our students are not police officers from day one. They're doing a degree at a cost to themselves, not at a cost to the police force, and that means we have 3 years to teach them, to build knowledge over time, to build resilience over time, to talk about some of the problems in police culture that I'm sure we will come on to talk about before they get exposed to it. So what we believe is that is a real opportunity in this entry route in terms of making a change when it comes to policing and some of the persistence of historic problems that there are in policing, because it is more of a slow burn in terms of the route.
So you're really the perfect people to be talking to for this panel today, because you've both been police officers, you've had, I know, we'll come to it in a moment, you've had specific experiences which have informed how you think about and how you approach teaching police officers now, is that safe to say? Okay, so Jen, you've got the microphone, so you said you've been in the police in the Met. So, it sounds like I'm just fishing for bad news here, but I do know you've got some stories to tell. So how, if I could put it delicately, what problems did you have within policing?
Yeah, I think one of the things is I don't like to talk negatively about policing. I'm very passionate about what policing does, and I think it's very important for me to say before that I don't intend to criticise any individuals or any individuals that I think are doing an incredible job in a very, very difficult environment. But I do think that in order to change things, we need to identify what the problems are, name them as what they are, and take ownership of them. And I have personally never experienced a culture that was as toxic than as what I experienced in the Met. In terms of outright sexism, and we talked about this before, where what I found so difficult to deal with is that it's normalised, and that sometimes there isn't necessarily a malicious intent behind it, because almost everything can be filed under banter. And it started in training school, and the trainers, some of the trainers, obviously not all of them, are part of it. They're egging people on, they're creating a dynamic where bullying gets built in. So you see people coming, joining the police with the right intention, they want to go out, they want to make a difference, they want to help people. and they get put in an environment where they get yelled at and they get pitted against each other. And also what doesn't happen in that environment is learning. Because if you are constantly managing your reputation because you don't want to get humiliated in front of your peers or by your trainers, you are not focusing on the information that you're being given with regards to the job that you're about to go out and do. Which is again another reason why I think that this entry route is so important in terms of us having them for 3 years and putting them in a safe environment where they can learn and where they can also build up some resilience to some of the issues that, unfortunately, such as the way they will have to be at the forefront of changing.
Yeah, thank you. So now if you're kind enough to pass the microphone to Laura, we've got a really extra useful dynamic here because, Jen, I've just asked you for your observances, but Laura, you've observed this from a slightly different angle because what you've just said, Jen, is that, or the impression I'm getting, is that if you are suffering sexism, banter, whatever you want to call it, that is causing you additional stress, then that's adding to all of the stresses that we've already talked about today, the ongoing trauma. So it's an increased pressure that is coming from, some people might refer to it as canteen culture, but we need to, as you say, we need to call it out as it is. But we also see this play out at home with our family, and we see the impact. And so, Laura, let me refer to you. How was your time in Merseyside Police?
Personally, I had a really good career. I had what I would describe as really good supervisors, and I count myself lucky to have had the experience that I had. And when I say lucky, I think it's probably the wrong terminology to use because you shouldn't have to feel lucky to have had good support through your career. And my journey in comparison to my partner's was very, very different. So my partner joined the police the year before I did, in 2008, and spared me to join, to be honest, because her initial training was absolutely fantastic. She was coming home, and it's a career I always wanted to join. Since I was a little girl, watching the bill and walking up and down to the beat of the theme tune. So when she joined, it spurred me on to join. Sadly, her experience soured very quickly. We now know she had complex PTSD, but it wasn't diagnosed, I'd say, for 10 years. She suffered on and off throughout those 10 years of her career, to the point where she was medically retired in 2018. During the course of that time, the treatment and support was completely lacking. And for myself and her, it was a real struggle. There were times where she was suicidal and I was still coming into work, trying to deal with my day-to-day job on response policing, but at the back of my mind worrying if she was going to come home from work herself or if she'd actually got to work. There were times where she'd go, sorry, back with you. The times where she would go off sick, and it would be periodically where we would have a period of consistency, steadiness. Oh, there we go, got it back. And then we would have a complete breakdown where she would be suicidal again, where we'd be looking at taking time off, getting some additional support in place. And with the additional support, it wasn't from the police, it was from external agencies, limited support from the NHS, but the amount of money we spent privately trying to get her support was unbelievable. And as I say, sadly it resulted in her being medically retired in 2018, which she didn't want, but as soon as it happened, there was a massive change. I mean, she is always going to struggle. She hasn't worked since. But the relief of knowing that pressure of going into work, having to put up a pretense, trying to pretend that everything's going all right, it really kind of brought the situation down and made life more manageable. And that's where we're at now. Life is a little bit more manageable. What happened along the way was that I had a medical issue where I was diagnosed. there we go. So in 2019, the year after she was medically retired, I received a diagnosis of cancer. So I was found to have a tumour on my spinal cord, which has severely damaged the nerves of my left leg, and meant I went on to restricted duties in work. The support I received was phenomenal. I had such amazing support from my supervisors. From the day of my diagnosis, I had my superintendent on the phone asking me what I needed. And all I could do was draw comparisons with my treatment and her treatment. And it was absolutely polar apart. And the difference between a physical injury and a mental injury is that the tangibility of it, you could physically see. You could see my x-rays, you could see my scans and say exactly what was wrong with me and how we went about getting recovery for me. But for my partner, that didn't exist. And that lack of tangibility made her very alienated in the workplace. To the point where people stopped asking me, how's Gemma doing? You know, people just avoided the conversation. And it was very noticeable. And that made it really difficult for me in the workplace to know there was those difficulties and differences of treatment between physical and mental injury.
Yeah, I'm sorry you had to go through that. Now, because that you went on that journey with her over 10 years, you're going to have a very clear idea of what went on. And I think you've alluded to it already. So you said that you were lucky and she essentially wasn't. So you've observed this very closely. I think you are perfectly qualified to explain what happened to her. So what do you think?
So Gemma was diagnosed with complex PTSD, and it started very early on in her career. For us, we didn't know. We didn't have a clue what was going on. All we knew was all of a sudden her mood dropped. She was finding life difficult. She was considering suicide. And over time, we came to realise a lot of it was relating to specific incidents that she kept being deployed to, namely sudden deaths, really had an impact on her. And once we identified it, we tried to, highlight it to supervisors, and the blanket approach was, you've got to go to them. End of. You are a police officer, you go to what you're deployed to, and we can't pick and choose our jobs. So what they did was try to desensitise her by sending her to more. And needless to say, that did not work and resulted in her going off on long-term sick for another period. She eventually came back into an office role and was able to manage her time there, but then the physical symptoms came in with the PTSD. And at the time, as you alluded to, there's a lot of physical symptoms that come along with it, but it's stuff like aches and pains, thyroid problems, all little ailments that added together, and there wasn't one specific thing that she needed to address. So she was under a lot of different specialists for a lot of different things, and she was basically labelled as a difficult officer. And in one email that was kind of shared accidentally, she was called lazy. So her morale was rock bottom, and that's why I say when the decision came in 2018 to be medically retired, there was no hesitation for me in telling her it was the right thing to do. And I think eventually when that decision was made, it was a weight off having to keep up that pretense and try and prove that she wasn't lazy.
Yeah, exactly. I've heard that lazy thing mentioned, and many of the people who get in touch with me have said that they've also been accused of being lazy, which offends them more than almost anything. For people who started off in the job as passionate as the rest of us. I've also publicly, more than one officer have said, PTSD is just the new bad back, which is particularly unhelpful, I think. But I think you've just hit on something which is really important to highlight just before we move on a bit, for anyone listening from occupational health departments or human resources, that this collection of smaller ailments, a clustering of them, there is all sorts of physical ailments associated with PTSD, because PTSD can totally turn your hormones wild. Your cortisol goes up, it can interfere with all other kinds of hormonal interactions. So all sorts of extraordinary, wild and wonderful symptoms can happen. So even that in itself has to become a red flag. We have to be understanding these things, because it's not that we don't have the evidence for it. It's not that we don't have the collective understanding of these things. It's just not yet seeped into the understanding of police institutions. So if we take nothing else from today, then perhaps we should consider that. But you also, I mean, you sort of explained it in a way, because you said you had a good supervisor, and the idea of sending someone to more things that's causing them stress. I mean, that doesn't surprise me at all, because I've been a cop in the 80s and 90s, and you would hope that you'd move on from that, but we haven't, have we? Because and I'll put this to you actually, Jen, would you say that strategy and that thinking to actually desensitise an officer by sending him to more things is actually evidence of existing desensitisation in the supervisors making that decision? That there's a lack of empathy, and could that be part of this mental health cultural crisis?
Absolutely. I think the key thing from my perspective, and I was quite shocked by this when I first joined, was that there's a complete lack of a trauma-informed approach. People don't know what trauma is, they don't know what the symptoms are. And then at the same time, you have that paired with an idea of how things work that is vastly out of line with what all of the evidence tells us. So the idea was also that if you're new in service and you haven't been given the training that you should have had, we should send you to the most difficult incidences. Which again, it raises the anxiety. It also puts people in danger. It puts the officer in danger, but it also is a disservice to the people they're being sent to. And for me, a key stress that I experienced was I wanted to do a good job. I felt a huge amount of responsibility in this job, and I did not feel like I was given support or training in order to do that job properly, which was ultimately why I left at under 2 years. And I think there's so many cases where if you try and de-escalate, or you try to explain, so like what you're trying to do is like, no, we know best, and then we go with the control and command approach. And that links, I think, to another point that was raised earlier, that sort of takes away any meaningfulness in terms of what you think you can offer as an individual in terms of knowledge and experience that you might have. And it also limits what each individual in the organisation can do, because nobody wants to stand out. So we have a sense, as human beings, we have an innate sense that we want to belong. And in a job as dangerous and as demanding as policing, it's really, really important that you have the support of your colleagues. So you're not going to risk losing that by sort of challenging things that need to be challenged, or speaking up about things, which is another thing that I still think about. We've had this conversation before. There are a number of things where I think back and I go, someone said this to me, or someone did this to me when I was a police officer, colleague. Why did I not challenge that? If that happened now, I would absolutely challenge that. And it's because, number one, you're so exhausted because it's constant, and you have to pick your battles. But ultimately, at the same time, I feel that every time I didn't challenge it, I'll make it more difficult for the next person that gets exposed to it. And I think that's where sort of all of these issues sort of start intersecting in terms of moral injury as well. And I think it all comes down to an occupational culture that does not recognise that they have a responsibility. Human beings, if you put any organism in a toxic environment, it will adapt in order to survive. Mm. And so you have a responsibility for creating a culture. And I think this is also where it links to recent events, where people like Cousins and Kerry are spotted because they're going to be outliers. They're not going to be nicknamed the rapist by their mates and patted on the shoulder. So that, to me, is a testament of a culture. If that doesn't flag up, but it is part of a normalised, then there's a responsibility that the organisation is not living up to.
Absolutely. And just for those people abroad who don't know, just a reference to a news story that you just made, Cousins' reference to a police officer, a famous case where he turned out to be a rapist. Of a brutal rape and murder, and it has turned out that his colleagues were joking about his inclinations towards sexual violence before that date. So you make a very strong and valid point that that's something we should take away from today, that it's up to all of us to just try and develop that culture to protect society from people like that. Now, I'm going to revisit trauma-informed policing and what that actually means in terms of interaction and meaningfulness shortly. But before we do, I'd just like to, if you pass the microphone to Laura. The first time we chatted, you said something that was really fascinating, well, lots of fascinating things to me, but there's a particular thing I want to pick out. Because your model of training police involves cops being taught and then going out and coming back again, you said that you noticed the difference. So can you just explain what that and what differences you observed?
Yeah, of course. So the first 11 weeks that student officers come to university, we get the usual excitement, nerves, the enthusiasm, you know, the engagement and really wanting to go out there and do that job. What is really noticeable, and more so now, is that when officers are coming back in year 2, when they've been out on a period of sustained deployments, whether it be response or other policing areas, there is a lot of, what's the best word to describe? They're coming back jaded, they're coming back stressed, they've got caseloads coming out of their ears. You will see them in class on their laptops, answering emails from the force or keeping on top of jobs as they're trying to concentrate on work. And sadly, we do see retention issues as well. Our third year cohort have reduced dramatically from what we had in year 1. And you could say that's, you know, the stresses of the apprenticeship. It could be, you know, external stresses, and I would say it's probably a combination of lots of different factors. But what's definitely at play there is those stresses from the workplace, the fact that they are mentally and physically exhausted by the work that's being put on them.
Well, as many people have said so far today, policing is a very difficult job. But one of the arguments that we're making today is that in terms of the mental health workload of police, this has got significantly worse in only a 10-year period, which is a big concern. So you'll be chatting to a lot of these cops, and you've already mentioned the workload, you've made reference to just the weight of the workload. But we've also made reference to a toxic working environment. Some people feel the pressure of the work and consider themselves perhaps to be bullied, or struggling to adapt. As Jen's just said, any organism will adapt to their environment, and sometimes adapting to your environment means learning to fit in, right? Learning to fit into an existing culture, or learning to put up with what they find difficult or toxic or challenging. So do you have any kind of conversations which sort of give you an indication of what's going on out there, apart from the workload?
Yeah, absolutely. I regularly chat with the students, and particularly over certain subject areas that we do in year 2. So we do about wellbeing and mental health. We revisit it from the first year because it takes on a whole new meaning when they come back in that second year. And I do have some open and honest discussions with them. It's a free space for them to voice their concerns. And a lot of the time we do get that conversation coming up that support from supervision is not there. Whether it be because of the lack of experience in supervisors, and as you highlighted before, we've got, you know, sergeants who are in charge of big teams, big response teams with very little service. We've got less experienced officers on teams, so whereas when I was in the police I could turn to my more experienced colleagues to ask for advice and support, whether it was a job that I hadn't dealt with before. We've got some student officers coming back with less than 2 years service saying that they're the most senior officers on their blocks, and that is just frightening to think. Obviously very capable officers, but where is their support when they've got newer students coming through and looking at them as the experienced cops who are there to look up to and take advice from? So I think the stresses are really high. It's not just the workload, it's the mix of the environment and that toxic culture that is also present as well.
And would you agree that when people, I'll answer first the point about how young people are in service. Now, to the non-police listening to this online or in the room, I have to emphasise that as a former police officer, that fills me full of horror, real horror. The idea of, because the multitude of different things that we get sent, that police get sent to, the huge variety, to not have that collective experience to support you is really frightening. Really frightening. It's hard to express that to somebody who's not been a police officer. So that's horrific. Now, I just want to unpick if there's a link between increased stress loads, because we're identifying that there is more stress now than there was. Is there a link between increased stress and toxic cultures? Is one more likely to harbour or foster another? Jen, what do you think?
My immediate response is yes, and then I was really sort of trying to sort of come up with a really well-phrased answer as to why that is, and sound really scientific about it. Yes, absolutely. And I think it's number one, when you're stressed and you've got a lot of demands on you from all sorts of sources, internally, externally, it's much harder to reflect. It's also much harder to sit down with someone else who maybe is in the same position and extend some compassion and empathy to them. So that obviously also links to vicarious trauma and things like that. But because you have to deal with heuristics, you have to make shortcuts in your decisions. And then depending on the type of situation that you're in and the type of decisions that you're making, sometimes heuristics are a good thing. But sometimes you do need a well thought through, considered response that is worth taking time over. And if the responsibility is on you as an individual in a situation like that, you just have to make a decision. You just have to do the best that you can. But you haven't really got the time to look at all the issues, understand what the issues are. Then again, for me, sort of like I would feel incredibly guilty about it. I would not get not only job satisfaction, but I'd be wondering, am I actually causing harm rather than helping someone because I haven't been able to fully understand the issues?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that in turn again causes more stress.
Yeah. Laura, what do you think? I mean, I'm asking for your opinion really based on your observance of these from these conversations you've had. Does this stress that we are acknowledging is increased because of the young cohort and the lack of older support, does this contribute to a toxic environment?
Absolutely, yes. I think it's obvious to see, but equally, when you're coming into a job like policing, it's not something you do half-hearted. It's something, as like myself growing up, it was something I always wanted to do. So when you actually get into that job, when you get attested and that pride is there wearing the uniform, you want to keep it. So those stresses that creep up, you're expected, the general expectation is you deal with it. You're a police officer, if you don't like it, get out the door. And that phrase comes up time over. And if it's a job that you have always wanted to do, you're going to suck it up and get on with it. And that stress and pressure will build up and up to the point where it overflows, and at that point it's too late. When you're at that point where you're having a mental breakdown or you cannot function, that is too late to be recognising it. And that's what we're trying to do at the moment, is get officers to recognise those key points, those initial signs that stress is starting to creep in, and let them know that it's okay to express that and vocalise that they're struggling at that point in time. And it's a big challenge to get what I call is overcome that blue pride, that issue of I'm not okay. And it's a massive thing in policing to actually put your hand up and say you're not okay. And we need to take that stigma away.
Absolutely. Just to clarify something, by suck it up, that can mean change my behaviour to fit in. And change my behaviour to fit in can fuel that growing toxic culture. So I just want to reflect just for a moment before we move on a bit. So we've acknowledged that the mental health crisis is getting worse, and we've acknowledged that we believe that the young cohort, the fact that we've lost that experience, has significantly contributed to this crisis, and importantly, how this crisis is playing out in the media not just in the UK, United States, various other countries, especially France as well. So in the case of the UK, the cause, as I said at the beginning, part of the cause is quite clearly austerity. So I just want to say this, just get this in there, that when politicians criticise police who have done something wrong and things have gone wrong, we need politicians to accept the responsibility of this. Would you agree? So I can't help making the political point. I can't help it. I can't help it. It's a legitimate part of the argument that this has been caused. This is something that's been done to the police. Now the Federation, we have some of the Federation in the room, have been very good at commenting on this and warned us about the impact that would have on, that austerity would have on policing. But I would argue it's worse than we thought, and worse around the corner. So you also made a point to me, Laura. We talked about the fact that young people are more vulnerable to mental health problems. Just remind me how our conversation went about that.
I can't recall it myself, to be honest.
Well, did you?
Was it you, Jan?
I said in a previous conversation that the frontal lobes, which is where consequential thinking, amongst other important things, is located, aren't fully developed until about 25. Now, the mean age on the response team that I was on was probably around 23. And so again, we're putting people whose brain functions are still developing in a particular way in highly dangerous situations without the experience sort of other officers, which maybe was there in the past.
Okay, well, I'm glad we got that point in there, because this is an additional concern to all of the conversation that we've had so far, that apart from the actual interactions that people are having, whether it's a toxic culture or what they're dealing with on the streets, there is also a physiological issue which exacerbates this problem because of their age, essentially. And I don't believe that's being considered at the moment institutionally. Okay, so Jen, you mentioned trauma-informed policing before, and I think this is a very important thing to touch on, because you sort of talked about it within, in terms of recognising each other's trauma within policing. But also, I think that trauma-informed policing, in terms of understanding the causes of the trauma, of what police are dealing with, is also a way of reducing the mental health pressure on those officers dealing with it. So, and I know you'll be able to explain this better than me, but my point is, how do you think the mental health pressure might be reduced by teaching more effectively officers about where the behaviour of citizens comes from? You know, if you're dealing with something that's someone being violent, if you're dealing with someone who has problematic drug use, for example, do you think it's helpful for the mental health of officers to be more informed about that?
No, please bring me back to this if I go slightly off tangent, because I believe that you cannot do it without also addressing the culture. Because what I experienced, and I'm aware that might be an anecdotal experience, was a culture that was so inward-looking and so anti-intellectual, and we don't want to hear anything about what medical research says or anything like that. So you can give them the information, but it will not be taken on board. So I think that is a key problem, unless you address that simultaneously. And the other reason being that in order to have a truly trauma-informed approach, you need to be able to express vulnerability, obviously within an appropriate context, and the police culture that I experienced will not allow for that. So you could pay lip service to it, you could put educational programs out there, but you won't get, in my opinion, the authentic sort of fundamental change and taking it on board. And I think what we've seen, especially when sort of Cranston were speaking, we saw a lot of words like empathy and compassion. Ironically, all the things that as a culture we have feminised, which are somehow frowned upon in policing, funnily enough. And I think unless you address that at the same time, and then you bring people in and you create a safe space in which people can talk about their own experience, can listen to other people's experience of trauma, and can understand it, then you will see a shift. The context in which I teach about it at the moment is with regards to sort of all the myths that are out there about sort of deception detection. Obviously, there is no one sign that will tell you whether someone is lying or not. But there are a lot of myths out there. And again, what I saw was in a culture that sort of like doesn't really sort of like at the moment incorporate an evidence base. Sort of like you can have an expert say that, and people say, no, I know better. Like if they do this, if they do that, they're always lying. So we make a point with our students to kind of talk about if you interview a victim, and I think I've given this example before, if you interview a victim of a prolonged attack who can tell you how many tiles there were on the ceiling and what smells they were experiencing, but they cannot tell you what the face of the attacker looked like, that is a sign of trauma. That is how the brain reacts to trauma. But if you don't know that, you might think they're lying, or they're being deliberately difficult, or there's something wrong with them. So I think you've got a number of issues that come together there. Does that answer the question?
It does, very much so, and I think that's a really important point. I think I'll ask a slight follow-up question, but I suspect that we'll dive into this more in the last section when we look to the future and what we can do about this, because I think a part of that conversation later will be, well, how do we design the systems? How do we fit education, what you're doing at the University of Law? How do we fit that into the systems and use that way of thinking to actually change the culture, change the stigma? I know there's a great deal of good work going on within the College of Policing and within different police forces about being trauma informed, but I personally don't think it's far enough, because if you use the example, for example, of people who use drugs problematically, we know that 2/3 of people who use heroin problematically are self-medicating for childhood trauma, specifically childhood trauma. There's an enormous amount of evidence which says that. But I mean, the two of you first, if you answer this question first, Jen, do you think most officers have an idea of that?
No. And we had this conversation facilitated very poorly when I was at Hendon, where it was basically, what do you think about drug users? And basically it just all becomes about judging people whose real life experience, whose history you know absolutely nothing about. And at no point do we look at research evidence or anything like that. And ultimately, I think in a profession like policing, where you have that sort of like the majority of people, we're all on the same page. We're here because we want to make a positive difference. We want to reduce harm. We want to make life better for people. We want to help people. Ultimately, that should be the overarching aim. But instead, it sort of turns into this sort of ego-driven, sort of like I'm right and you're wrong, and it really becomes all about sort of judging other people and sort of presenting yourself sort of like in a positive light at the expense of someone else.
Absolutely. What do you think, Laura? Because you've got a different experience that you can actually see in real time what the student officers are thinking, and they're going to soak up the culture and beliefs of people on the shift, aren't they? So you can teach them with the best will in the world, but they've got other influences of peers, haven't they? So what's your experience of that? Do they know that?
It's interesting because I'm a module leader on the threat arm risk module, so this is my bag, this is what I talk about. I deliver about trauma-informed approaches. We look at the reasons behind, as you say, why someone might be able to recall certain things in an interview, why they may be standoffish or react in a certain way or in an unpredictable way. And the students take it on board. They really do kind of have a light bulb moment. Yet they come back in year 2 and talk about targets, they talk about statistics, they talk about being put on action plans, and that's what consumes them. Those thoughts of why people are behaving, why people are addicted to drugs goes out the window when you've got reds and greens that you're concentrating on. And I think that's where we've really got to change the dynamics.
Just explain reds and greens for us.
So target orientated policing, so you need to get a certain amount of stop searches, stop checks, arrests, traffic tickets. It's all stuff that was there when I joined policing, and then it was phased out, and it seems to be creeping back in a little bit more.
Yeah, I've been following uncomfortably where targets have been creeping back in. Now, a lot of my police career, I experienced targets where an arrest was an arrest, it was a tick. It was a tick in the book, and you could be criticised if you weren't chasing those ticks. Now, if we put that into the context of what we've heard from Cranston today, and the conversation or the realisation that actually meaningful police work helps officers' mental health, and meaningless can not only add to the workload and the stress that that workload brings, but also cause harm through moral injury. I mean, I'm assuming I'm answering the question for you almost, but I'm also asking for comment. Is that would seem to me to be potentially disastrous to the mental health of our officers, because they're having to do meaningless work, which is actually contrary to what you're teaching them.
Absolutely, it's completely contradictory, and it increases the stress and pressure on them to get those targets, to not consider diversionary methods because they need to get an arrest or whatever it may be that month that they're short on, and all they can focus on is, I don't want to be put on an action plan of improvement. So any considerations around alternatives, it just isn't thinkable for them. Because
of the pressures from supervisors.
Absolutely.
And the system. Okay, so now, I don't know if you can comment on this or not, but something that I've observed, because I speak to a lot of cops, it's amazing how many get in touch with me. We've got younger officers, we've already established that, but there is a societal shift going on, there is a cultural shift going on, where the current generation do not see recreational drug use as quite the problem as perhaps the generation before. I assume you agree with that, because you'll have observed it. Which means our young officers don't want to be criminalising young people for possessing drugs. They don't want to be criminalising people who have gone raving and taken a couple of MDMA pills and they've got a couple of pills in their pocket. They don't want to, because they're part of the same generation and things have changed. So it's perhaps a crass way of phrasing it, but should we be dragging policing into the 21st century with that, in that regard? Or is that, tell me, is that an unreasonable comment?
No, I wouldn't say it was. I think reform needs to be looked at. It's one of the big reasons I'm here, to kind of bring that to the board. And as you say, that there's a social shift, and we can't just ignore it.
Absolutely. And would you agree that that social shift, the fact that young officers are in contradiction with their collective norms in some degrees, that's asking for moral injury? Absolutely.
It's that conflict again. They're getting conflict from every angle.
So we've got young officers who physiologically are more susceptible to developing mental health issues because of their age. They no longer have the support of older people to turn to for advice, and also increasingly they've got additional moral injuries. And if they do, from what you told me, your experience of your partner, if they do develop a particular sensitivity or mental health injury, I should better call it, to a certain type of policing, they're not getting the support. So I know that, you've alluded to this already, that you are, through your work, and I thank you for that, trying to tackle this from an educational perspective. Now, we've already identified that sometimes that's in conflict with what the institutions want, but just tell us briefly, because we're almost out of time for this section, what are you doing to try and tackle this? You've said some of this already, but just briefly.
Yeah, so it's a real reinforcement on recognising as an individual what your stresses are, how that exhibits itself. So what's your comfort zone, and how do you know when you're moving out of that comfort zone, so that they can detect really early doors when something isn't right. And I think that's something in policing that's really important, because we tend to push past those barriers. The amount of officers that won't take a sick day because they don't want it on their record is unbelievable. No one wants that sickness record, and you'll push past all kinds of illnesses. So naturally you will push past that feeling of, I'm a bit stressed, I've got a bit of anxiety, I'm not sleeping well, and you just keep going. And what we're trying to do is to get officers to realise where that comes from, where they feel it, and to reach out for that support at that early stage.
Jen, last word?
Again, gonna go slightly back. It's interesting, because one of the slogans actually that we use to promote our policing degree is be part of the change to bring policing into the 21st century. And I've seen it, so because before I taught on the policing degree, and before I was an officer, I taught on criminology and psychology degrees. And there's been a massive shift whenever the topic of drugs comes up in terms of what young people know about it as well. They're way more informed, and the evidence base is actually there compared to the political narrative and the ideology. And obviously we could go into the history of sort of like where did the war on drugs come from and the racism that is inherent in that. And they know. I remember sort of like when I'd been teaching this for a couple of years, and I was quite used to sort of like having to start at a certain point. And then it gets to, we know this, miss, we know it already, what do we do about it? That is the question that I get asked now. I mean, we still cover it, but I think it absolutely links to that. And interestingly, you just mentioned two examples that for me were two key reasons to hand in my resignation when I was in the police. And number one was I was told I had to do a certain amount of stop and search in a borough with a primarily diverse and young population. And I saw how that was being done by other officers, and I could not do that without compromising my core values. And the other one, obviously, is the drugs issue, where so if we have a legislation that is, in my opinion, so in contradiction to what the evidence is and that is causing such harm, then I cannot be part of an institution that just blindly enforces that. And I think that's the dilemma that a lot of young officers have. And in terms of, sort of what are we doing, obviously education is part of it, but again we don't want to make the same mistake. We can't put the burden on the individual. So it's also about sort of combining that with sort of taking care of yourself, and sometimes the right thing to do is to leave a job. And to then have an impact in a different way. So one last thing I'm going to mention is that we've just done is we're piloting a course run by mental health professionals about suicide prevention and suicide awareness with our policing and criminology students. And what was really interesting to see, this is the microphone I'm forcing the time on. What was really interesting to see was the response that we got. So students where you sort of normally as a tutor, I haven't seen you in 6 weeks, where sort of saying, well, I know we don't normally have class during that time of the year, but this sounds like something I really want to get involved in. So the expressions of interest we had is a much higher expressions of interest that we've had for anything else that we've done thus far, which again I think shows that there's an appetite and that there's a different value system that in order to bring policing into the 21st century sort of like needs to be matched.
Well, that's good to hear, and a good note to end on. I think we will pick up some of these threads in the last section when we say what look to the future and what can we do next. But for now, thank you very much.